I want to welcome you to the 25th Annual Gil Oberfield Memorial Lecture. My name is Jesse Lazar. I'm the Executive Director here at AIANY New York. We are so pleased to have you all here tonight as we celebrate really a milestone in this wonderful lecture series. This lecture was founded as in the memory of Gil Oberfield, who was a member and former chair of our Interiors Committee here at AIANY New York. I want to especially welcome and thank members of his family for being here tonight. We always look forward to seeing you at this. Like Gil did, this event brings together speakers who excel in the field of interior architecture. And we're pleased this year to have internationally renowned firm Leong Leong join us tonight as our featured speaker. I want to thank our lead sponsor, Gensler, for their support of this program, their steadfast support of this program. This would not be possible without your continued support. And also, thank you again, as always, to the Oberfield family for joining us and for supporting this event, too. I want to thank our Interiors Committee, particularly our co-chair, Susan Link and Stefan Jaklich, and for organizing tonight's lecture. And now, please join me in welcoming Rocco Giannetti from Gensler, to past co-chair of this committee, to kick us off and introduce our speakers and talk a little bit about the history of this. Thank you so much.
All right, good evening, everyone. I'm Rocco Giannetti. I'm a managing principal at Gensler, and it's a true privilege to welcome you to the 2025 Gil Oberfield Memorial Lecture. I'd like to take a moment to share some reflections about the architect this series was named for and why this lecture continues to resonate so deeply with our community. Gil was a beloved family man, a dear friend to many, some of whom are in the audience this evening, a dancer, a wordsmith. He grew up on Long Island, one of 4 siblings, and earned his undergraduate degree from Yale. He later completed his graduate studies at Harvard Graduate School of Design. And while working in Moshe Safdie's office in Jerusalem, he met Naomi Dennis. They married and raised Sophie, Ezra, and Talia together. Gil went on to become a principal at Gensler New York's office, where he designed innovative workplaces for firms such as PwC, McKinsey & Company, and Wachtell Lipton. And of course, Gil was a longtime chair of the AIANY New York Interiors Committee. He was a connector, someone whose energy and passion for design were matched only by his dedication for bringing people together. With warmth and generosity, Gil helped strengthen the ties between New York's architecture community and the interiors community, championing programs that were both educational as well as they were inspiring. Oh, a little page sticking, sorry. Under his leadership, the Interiors Committee became a hub for collaboration and opportunity. He drew in people not just with his ideas, but with his kindness and charisma. The chapter launched the Gil Oberfield Memorial Lecture just 1 year after his passing as a way to carry forward his vision. It's a testament to Gil's expansive network that many of the early speakers were so enthusiastic about participating. Each year, we honor individuals whose work exemplifies excellence in interior architecture, those who, like Gil, uplift the profession while building community. And this year marks a poignant milestone. It's 25 years since Gil's passing. How happy it would make Gil to know that he continues to bring people together. And so, in that same spirit of celebration and community, we're honored to kick off the 2025 Gil Oberfield Memorial Lecture. So now I'll speak about this evening's speakers. This year's lecture features Leong Leong, an internationally recognized architecture studio and design consultancy based here in New York. The firm partners with forward-thinking clients, cultural enterprises, and institutions to build culturally resonant and advanced social agendas within the built environment. Leong Leong was founded in 2009 by brothers Chris and Dominic. with a portfolio that encompasses a broad range of projects and scales. From urban campuses and institutional spaces to interiors and furniture, their collaborative design approach integrates aesthetic, social, and ecological concerns to create spaces that foster new ways of living, learning, and convening. Working across disciplines, its diverse staff expands the role of architecture, synthesizing strategic thinking with formal and material experimentation. A little bit about our speakers. Dominic Leong, AIA, is a founding partner at Leong Leong. He's an educator. Dominic has held invited faculty positions at Columbia University, the Cooper Union, and MIT. In 2024, Dominic held the Louis I. Kahn Visiting Assistant Professor of Architectural Design at Yale School of Architecture, and Dominic is on the board of directors of the Architectural League of New York. Chris Leong, AIA, also founding partner at Leong Leong, is currently the Vice President of Interiors at Miller Knoll. He has held invited faculty positions at Columbia University, Cornell University, and MIT as well. So with that, let's have a hearty welcome to our guest speakers this evening. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction. Can everyone hear us okay? Yeah, I'm Dominic. I'm Chris. We're brothers. Yeah, we're really honored to receive this award and be a part of this illustrious legacy of incredible designers. So it's really an honor to be here, and thank you to the AIA and the Center for Architecture for having us. We were just talking before that in 2010, we were also part of the New Practices group that sort of you can see the current exhibition outside there, so it's always nice to have that kind of connection to come back. Louder, yes. So yeah, we're gonna just get into it. We titled the lecture Interior Worlding, because we think a lot about architecture as a kind of world building practice. We grew up in Northern California. Our dad was an architect, a builder, and we always like to start off our lectures with childhood photos. And this is a picture of Chris and myself just digging in this piece of property that eventually became the home that our father designed and built, and that we worked on as we were growing up. So in a lot of ways, we're always around architecture, either literally spending our summers sanding the siding and painting it or things like that. But it's always kind of been a part of our lives from the very beginning. And then fast forward to 2009, when Chris and I founded our practice. For a long time, our office was on Bowery. And we spent a lot of our early years really using and thinking of architecture as like a laboratory for experimentation. Simultaneously, we're working kind of globally, and some of our first projects were interior projects within the fashion industry. So reflecting, over the 15 years, it's a bit of a opportunity to like look back and see where we've come from, where we evolved, and where things are heading for us. But it's really important that we just want to acknowledge all the people who've collaborated with us. I think there's over 60 folks who have worked with us in our office, and our practice is very much a collaboration. Everything that we've produced comes out of this collective effort, and I think it's really important. We both think it's really important to acknowledge that labor and that collaboration as instrumental to practice. And so when we're putting together this lecture, it's really hard to think of what interiors are, knowing that we're trained as architects. It's in our minds, there's really no distinction between interiors and architecture. And so we really love this quote by Louis Kahn: "A building is a world inside of a world," because it starts to capture this idea that even if we're talking about interiors as a way of understanding architecture, we're always thinking about these realities that we're building together collectively and building the world together and trying to make sense of it. And so one way we think about our practice is really an intersection between an aesthetic practice, a social or cultural practice, and an ecological practice. And I think at different moments in history that architecture has been more or less aligned with this kind of like triad. And it just seems, increasingly the mandate that we understand architecture as equally all of these: aesthetic, social, and ecological. And I think in our early years, we explored a lot of ways like this convergence of the aesthetic practice and the social practice, and the ecological practice continues to evolve in how we think about resource. And so some of the early projects were all interiors. This is a fashion pop-up store that we designed in 2010. And we were thinking about how aesthetic practices, we sort of, aesthetic's not just about what you see, but it's about an idea that we make sense of the world through aesthetic experiences, whether it's visual, whether it's, performance. All of these literature, all of these kind of mediums are ways that we make sense of the world, and we do that together. And so aesthetics are fundamentally social in that regard. So we were thinking about how this pop-up fashion store, which is supposed to display clothes, what if the first thing you encounter is actually other people, and the clothes are the second things you encounter? So we're always kind of playing with the kind of social aspect of it, and how this space could generate unexpected encounters in the context of a pop-up fashion store. Along the way, all these kind of like formal and material obsessions kind of, you never know where they come from. They probably come from childhood, but we grew up just building with materiality. And so this sort of obsession with materiality is like, it's almost hard for us to talk about because it's so much a part of how we think. We think a lot about the relationship between form and materiality. And in this case, a lot of it's about thinking about simple shapes that can radically transform an interior space. So in this case, this sort of skateboard ramp.
I think part of going back to like the world building and going back to why we start with kind of like our childhood is making forts kind of, I think our relationship always kind of like is about this kind of idea of like making something together, and that is inclusive of all the people we work with. But these projects, I think that we're showing tonight, starting with these kind of, simple scales, we're always about kind of like experimenting, and I think that's when architecture and interior architecture is always at its best, is where you're sort of testing something sort of unknown. And a lot of these projects, they kind of start with a kind of an idea, and you kind of, we were building many of these projects ourselves, and learning as we go. And I think as the practice has kind of matured, we've tried to translate still that kind of like naive kind of like thinking into like larger scale projects.
And so, yeah, a lot of the design process was really thinking about these sort of formal or organizational language, like in this case, the storefront for art and architecture, the swinging doors. We started to think about the geometry of arcs that could start to define these different spaces within this exhibition. And so this idea of having a really simple but clear plan or organization, and then introducing the materiality that creates a different kind of perceptual understanding of that. So a lot of times we were thinking about, ready-made materials that we could reappropriate and present in a way that almost feels a little bit like a surrealist approach to that. So these are mirror blinds that we ordered, I can't remember, like
Through Amazon or something.
Through Amazon, and they got shipped from Ohio. And they're literally like those blinds you put on like a sliding door. And a lot of this is thinking about, resourceful use of materials and how we can do a lot with a lot of like ready-made material systems. But as like the practice evolved, we realized that these, early experiments in installation and developing this language gave us a lot of, almost like an archive of ideas that could start to translate into larger scales, into like more permanent architecture. So on the left, you see an interior space we did for Brookfield. And
yeah, it's a lobby entry in Greenpoint. I think you'll see a lot that we work a lot with vertical mirror blinds. it's a kind of a ongoing interest, but I think it's also kind of starts with this kind of interest in kind of texture, this kind of idea of taking kind of simple, familiar things and applying them in ways that becomes slightly more unfamiliar.
Yeah, so this idea that we can create architecture that in a lot of ways just makes you want to touch it, and has a playful use of materiality, things that look hard, feel soft, and vice versa. So we're always like thinking about ways to like create these embodied experiences that sort of move beyond the visual and become more tactile. So this is a fashion flagship store in Seoul, Korea for Philip Lim that we completed earlier. But also thinking about how these like simple shapes and form as like a collection of objects can create a seating environment for it's actually a convening space for the Sharjah biennial a few years ago. And so the whole idea here is that this landscape of objects could be stored on the wall and come down in the course of the Biennale to actually be used as seating or become a kind of backdrop. So we're going to go into depth in a few projects. This idea of like building worlds, bodily worlding, if we were kind of going back and forth about like what words to use, and it seemed important to think of it as like a verb that we're constantly in a practice of we never really arrive at a world, but we're constantly thinking about it. So this is last year for the Costume Institute at the Met. We were invited to collaborate with Andrew Bolton, who's the chief curator of the Costume Institute, on the exhibition design called Sleeping Beauties, Reawakening Fashion. And it was an incredible experience working at the Met, and you're all probably familiar with the Met Gala and the role the Costume Institute plays. In a lot of ways, it's this amazing kind of interface between the institution and culture at large, and it has this kind of spectacle quality to it, and incredible exhibitions that are done every year, which is phenomenal given the scale and the pace that these exhibitions are executed. The one thing that we became interested in conversations with Andrew was he actually made this remark early on in collaboration that the body is sort of the common denominator that you can trace across all collections in the Met, which we found really interesting. And he specifically uses the term the dress body. And so it became a lens for us to understand the architecture of the museum through the body, and also the understanding that this legacy of this architecture comes out of understanding the body, through the Vitruvian Man, the proportionality of the ideal man, et cetera. And so what does it mean to think about bodies and architecture and bodies and institutions today, and how is fashion actually a medium in which those two things come together? So this particular show was an archival show. It alternates every year. And so Andrew, chief curator, sort of put this curatorial brief out, which was thinking about objects within the archive that were beyond conservation practices. So there's a term called inherent vice, so they're naturally decaying. And part of that is the idea that these objects are actually material and are subject to the effects of nature and decay over time. And so there was sort of this interesting theme of reawakening objects in the archive to kind of recover their sensory histories, and also think about the relationship between nature and fashion.
And also just the idea that these are artifacts that are, being held and being on display, but their actual true nature is that they're, on the human body, and that they actually have a kind of life, like a sensory life, that was part of the ambition of this exhibition, to kind of bring that to the visitor, to be able to experience the sound, the touch, and the different aspects.
And what eventually happened is we sort of built a building within a building, partly because kind of creating a multisensory experience requires an architecture that can deliver that. And so a lot of the early conversations were trying to think about how do we relate to nature. And on one hand, you have like the laboratory of Western science, which relates to nature through observation and reason. And on the other hand, you have the garden, which we relate to nature through a kind of embodied experience, through our senses, through our emotions. And it's really a space of joy as opposed to scientific inquiry. And the kind of conceptual evolution of the project really thought about an exhibition that could sort of be a hybrid between these two ways of relating to nature. And this idea of the English garden, which is sort of meandering and it's an unfolding episodic experience, versus the French garden, which is primarily like visual and you can perceive it two-dimensionally. And we thought that these kind of tensions were an interesting place to explore how the exhibition kind of framework would come together. And then from the very beginning, Andrew was talking about the collaboration with Nick Knight and these fully immersive environments that would actually require a lot of containment and enclosure. So he put on the table this idea of the molecular structure, which had these enclosed environments that were then connected. So it was really our job to like bring it all together in that sense. And so we were just exploring, solid void, like what's nature, what's laboratory, what's inside, what's outside, all the while working with the curatorial team as they were, developing the themes over time, just evolving this language, it actually turned out to be really strategic to have a bunch of bubbles that we could just move around.
I think what's also interesting about working with the Costume Institute in this particular exhibition is just the volume of artifacts that are constantly being curated over the course of the entire year. So that there's like a framework for the exhibition, but the sort of the end point doesn't happen until much later. So it has to kind of like be a kind of ongoing experiment to sort of get to a point before you can just say, let's build this thing.
Yeah, everything's moving in motion at the same time within this really like tight time frame. And so we ended up with essentially what looks like an intestine. And part of the design, this is such a highly attended exhibition that the flow rate of people moving through it is actually really critical. So this became a kind of linear journey, moving through episodes and thinking about with the curators which stories go where, which collection of constellation objects go where.
I'd say we're very proud of this floor plan. It's probably the most complex floor plan we ever did. Chloe and Remy, who worked on this is probably iteration like 85 of every single incremental move that happened in the plan. Mm-hmm. And so it all started to come to life. And essentially it's, extrusion of these, almost maze-like labyrinth with these domes on top, which you enter through the Tisch Gallery portal into this other world. And you first encounter a Brancusi sculpture of a head. And so one of the ideas was the reawakening of these garments that have this inherent vice. And so this idea of a Pepper's Ghost was discussed a lot early on, and the technicality of achieving that actually turned out to be pretty complex. So there's instances of these kind of holographic animations of some of the dresses that were digitally scanned and reproduced. And then it became an idea about how to create more analog experiences of a kind of holographic reawakening of these different dresses. So this kind of exploration of different sensory interactions. So this is a lenticular reproduction of a garment that slowly kind of gets activated as you move by it. Or the translation of a Christian Dior dress into a three-dimensionally printed wall texture and a reproduction of it. And I think what was really interesting is that the exhibition in some ways challenged the visitor to interact with the artifacts and the objects in a way that's not expected within a museum like the Met. So just like suggesting that you can touch something is a big deal. And this also became a real interesting conversation with the conservation department, which is usually in the background of exhibition making, but through Andrew's idea of bringing forth these fragile objects, conservation became actually really foregrounded in the exhibition. So these are some examples of that kind of holographic vitrine that presents these extremely fragile garments. And it was a constant back and forth between Andrew and then the chief conservationist about where that line was and what would be an acceptable thing to do with each individual artifact.
And I think one of the really interesting parts of this project was collaborating with the smell researcher, Sissel Tolas, who was able to extract molecules from some of the garments and represent the kind of olfactory experience of them. And so she was able to extract like the body odor of this dress and then translate it into a scent that like came out into the room. And it was a mixture of the kind of extraction of these sensory histories, but also sort of imagining what these floral patterns might smell like. So all of a sudden, there was a way to experience this history through smell, which was kind of incredible. And just walking through the exhibition, you arrive at this like open garden space that has a kind of like entire monolithic wall of dresses that are made from a very specific yellow dye, and a coat by Loewe that actually grew in the vitrine, which from a museum practices point of view was a lot of work. So they were actually growing it in the office, and then they would bring it in and let it slowly die over the course of the exhibition. And then these kind of incredible mappings of the textures that were scanned from the dresses by Nick Knight's team, and then projected and animated onto the walls. I don't know if this will play. I feel like it's going to go, but we'll just keep going. So eventually you end back up at the beginning, and there's a wedding dress that was worn by a socialite, and that there's an AI interface that actually allows you to talk to this historic figure who wore the dress. And so moving from kind of working within an institution and building a building within a building, we thought the next project is really about kind of a collective world making together, and it's the Anita Mae Rosenstein campus in Hollywood, California, for the Los Angeles LGBT Center. And this project really, started, in some ways starts in like 1969 with Stonewall protests, and with the understanding that LA actually had its own unique history of social activism related to the LGBTQ community that started off in 1959 with certain incidents at Cooper's Donuts, where these acts of police brutality toward the LGBTQ community, or the Black Cat riots in 1967. And so the organization really came out of this history of social activism. And I think one thing we were really interested in this history is like, what role does architecture play within social activism and the kind of evolution of social activism from an informal kind of grassroots effort to appropriating houses to create liberation houses and provide social services, to becoming kind of a little bit more institutional with these kind of public-facing spaces, and the center then kind of renovating the old IRS building in Hollywood, starting to build a cultural space, and which all led to 2008 when they bought a large property in Hollywood that would start to consolidate the network of social services that the LGBTQ center provided to Hollywood, or LA in a way. And so the project that we were commissioned to work on was actually this complex network of needs that included a variety of programs that consolidated their social services administrative headquarters, but also a continuum of living from a youth housing that goes up to senior housing, 100 units of senior housing.
And I think what's super interesting about the competition or the brief is that, how it was almost kind of described in the brief was a sort of quasi like utopian project. There was 6 different types of housing, from the homeless shelter to the senior living. So it kind of represents this whole spectrum of kind of intergenerational living, kind of all into one kind of campus. And so the question is really like, how do you kind of create both kind of distinct kind of worlds or spaces for people to live, but also make it feel cohesive? And I think there was some interesting kind of things that we were, exploring.
And one of the spaces that we were really excited about, which actually wasn't included in the beginning of the program, was what is now called Pride Hall, and it was a space of celebration and convening that became a sort of flex space that, in a lot of ways, was sort of is sort of an interface between the campus and the rest of the city, that this is an Earth, Wind, and Fire dance class that is a video, but we're going to kind of go through it. So I think zooming out, I think in this case, it was really sort of understanding this evolution of going from informal collectivity to like a formalized typology or even institution, and entering into that process as architects and trying to understand like what is this relationship between kind of grassroots community and also institutionality, where this project actually offers a kind of civic presence to the LGBT community that otherwise hasn't existed at this scale. And I think there's a lot of questions about like what's gained and what's lost, what happens when you become an institution, like there's a lot of like mandates on funding, how that money is used, and how that actually governs a lot of the way the space can be designed from an institutional point of view. So in that regard, we were really thinking about what are kind of architectural typologies that would allow us to think at this sort of like urban or civic scale. And so, and of course, like LA, the indoor-outdoor history of the courtyard houses, but also looking at something like the Matt building that has this kind of porosity to it, where you can start to see how like courtyards could like replicate to create a larger urban form. So we just started experimenting with that, and thinking about a kind of urban form that was a sort of mosaic of programmatic shapes that created a kind of a unified but also differentiated urban mass. And so that is kind of what we started working with. And I think a huge part of it, and like a connection to, the idea of interior worlds, is the idea of these interior courtyards, which provide a safe outdoor space, which is something that's actually not very available for some of the clientele who are actually houseless and just need to have a safe outdoor space. So this idea of the courtyards became a way to create, bring light into the deep kind of wide floor plate, create these sanctuary spaces, but also be kind of buffers and connectors between the various programmatic elements. And so that really started to create a kind of, language where interior and exterior started to blend. So this is the Pride Hall flex space that opens directly onto this public space and this kind of urban living room. Or the lobby space where you can see a courtyard on one side and the sidewalk on the other. And one of the big things about this scheme is that, and I think it was kind of unique, is that we decided to submerge the parking, and that allowed us to create a kind of a continuity to the sidewalk, and actually make it more pedestrian oriented. And that was like a big move. So you can start to see, from above, this network of green courtyard spaces that sort of interact with these other larger programmatic volumes in context. And so, yeah, as an urban form, it has a kind of really calibrated porosity to it. So it's open in certain areas that are more public, and then it's really opaque in others. So here you can see the headquarters for the admin, the floating box, and then Pride Hall that kind of sticks up. But then everything in between is the youth center, which is actually very opaque, which is necessary for security. And so as you move around the building, it kind of never looks the same. There's these kind of iconic forms that have a slightly different presence as you move around, and then the porosity is registered at the scale of a kind of portal at the entrance to the youth center.
So another type of kind of collective living project, this one's on the East Coast. It's a 120 unit multifamily project in Philadelphia. It just happens to be, it's at the intersection of sort of two neighborhoods, Kensington and Fishtown. One's a more sort of historic, sort of like smaller scale residential, and one's a little bit more industrial. There also happens to be, it's, you know, a lot of like really amazing industrial character in the neighborhood, and also kind of really vibrant kind of arts communities. And this is Clay Studios. There's a Crane Arts building. In a lot of ways, it's kind of like Greenpoint or Williamsburg, where it's sort of the space where there is enough space to kind of experiment and kind of, you know, foster kind of creative collectives. And this project, which is a, you know, market rate development, but was also with the ambition that like bringing together art and living is like a worthwhile exercise, and to try to think about how to create housing that can support kind of creative communities. And so the project is really about trying to become a platform through the use of space and affording space for artists at below market rate. This is Michelle Lopez, who's a Philadelphia-based artist who actually worked on the project. That was a response to this idea of kind of creative collectives all kind of inhabiting the same community. Her project was called her work, One Under One Sky, kind of reflects that sort of idea that we're all kind of working, you know, in different ways, but, you know, in a sense together. And the work kind of is about sort of like coloring the brick facade as a kind of message, a kind of sign. You know, the project is unique in that it's a very long block. It's like one sort of monolithic thing. They call like the 5/1. It's a very typical developer model. But what we were kind of interested in is like just, you know, accepting that kind of length and the kind of longitudinalness of this space, which is right along North American Street. So the whole facade is monochromatic. It's using brick and precast, but it's really about this continuous awning and this continuous storefront. And that's really this kind of interface that becomes the space where there's artist studios along the storefront and different kind of retail storefronts. And similar to our, you know, other projects, it starts with like, you know, using a common material, but trying to do it in a slightly more unfamiliar way. This is the split brick technique where you take the brick and split it in half and then turn that broken end on the out, you know, to create a kind of almost like a wabi-sabi texture. So responding in a kind of contextual way to the neighborhood, but doing it with a kind of way that, you know, creates a kind of texture that's animated through the light when it rakes across the facade. And here's kind of a view. And so you can see that kind of continuous awning. And everything sort of in the middle are these kind of garage door roll-ups that are artist studios that are rented out below market rate that become kind of community spaces. And so there's a way in which these spaces can kind of almost spill out onto the sidewalk. This is an artist talk here that happened like the other week. Ulysses Books is an art bookstore that organizes a lot of events. And it was a project that we got to design both from the exterior, but also all of the interior spaces. It's really kind of almost like thinking of a collective living space or multifamily unit building, but in terms of like the most kind of domestic kind of spaces. Like this is the living room, sort of a sunken living room with the, you know, the backside of that seating has like a library. There's an artwork by Rashid Johnson, who's got a solo show at the Met or at the Guggenheim right now, which occupies the space. And then straight through is the co-working space. So it kind of responds to this idea of kind of working and being a creative, but also having that space as a kind of gathering space at the ground floor of the building.
I think one of the things I think interesting about interiors, like within the context of cities, like oftentimes we experience architecture through the interiors first. And so in these two projects, we were thinking a lot about that interface at the sidewalk and how the awning creates, you know, kind of transition to the interiors, but how that whole promenade becomes an opportunity to like invite the neighborhood in through these different ways of opening the facade or putting the living room like directly visible to the sidewalk.
Yeah, and also designing the space almost like if we lived here, like what would feel comfortable, what would feel warm, what would feel inviting, and to kind of imbue a kind of like casualness or informality into like a a building that has like many people living in it. And shifting scales from kind of that collective worlding to a more smaller scale, the more domestic scale. This is our first sort of, it's not really ground up, it's a renovation of an existing building, but our first kind of real residential project in Hancock Park in Los Angeles. It's kind of an underwhelming ranch house at the end of a cul-de-sac, probably the most like suburban thing you can think of, but right in the middle of like this great part of Los Angeles. The clients had a really unique brief. They own an art gallery, so they wanted the space the house to accommodate art, but not too much of it. Like they didn't want art on the walls. They collect video art, which is a unique thing. They had they wanted to be able to host a bunch of people, almost like an art gallery, but also they have 2 kids, so they wanted to feel very intimate and comfortable for their kids, and also that there was a kind of almost like a brief about materiality, which was loving like concrete block and metal and sort of what appear to be really like cold materials, but they actually felt like much more comfortable in that way.
I think there's also like conversations about challenging the cliches of domesticity. So like no plants, the idea of it feeling more like a hospitality or even commercial space. There was even the idea of putting in an automatic door,
yeah, shopping,
like you're going. So like from a
grocery store sliding doors.
So like from a design point of view, like this is a really interesting starting point to think about. That is a very so specific to like what they really imagined.
Yeah, and there was they didn't want a dining room because that was actually kind of a triggering thing. So
they wanted a co-working space.
They were comfortable calling their dining room a co-working space, which is what we did. But we thought a lot about Dan Graham and this idea of kind of inverting domesticity and kind of creating something that sort of like plays with what that kind of domestic space is. And also this idea of boundary, which kind of is always kind of coming up, going back to our earliest projects, is this idea of like doing interiors is always about inheriting some kind of boundary and working with it, and how you engage with that boundary is sort of the fundamental project in a way. So here's the house on the left, had a lot of kind of neoclassical articulations. I think there was some like lion sculptures and whatnot, but like we really kind of wanted to neutralize it and yeah.
This is considered historic in Hancock Park.
There's a lot of eclectic things. The other challenge of the project, because it's Hancock Park and because it is a historic district, has the condition that you can only renovate 50% of the building, or you have to go through a really extensive design review. So we wanted to avoid that. So the constraint was we could only renovate or touch 50% of the facade. We played with a lot of different ways to interject a figure or to create a kind of diagram that would sort of work with the boundary and create these different spaces, these different programmatic spaces in the floor plan. And where we landed was one sort of singular figure inserted right in the middle, almost creating like a cruciform. And the logic here was that this was the existing and this was the new. But the idea here is that inserting this figure and having that figure extend to the extent of the boundary created multiple courtyards. So there was sort of the kids' courtyard, the kind of pool courtyard, the kind of rock garden, and then the entry courtyard, and then sort of the co-working courtyard. Almost a kind of like a 9 square in a way. This is the entrance. We kind of really just neutralized and worked with like the very typical LA materials, or typical to us, stucco. Looks out across to the backyard to an 8 Quincy Jones, so it's got some great neighbors. But when you're in the space, you really don't see above the horizon. It has a kind of, almost like a Batagan kind of feeling of being in this kind of cloister. And the space is sort of what anchors the center of that figure is this box. We called it the media cube. The box didn't have a texture actually for like 5 years. The project was almost done and we still didn't know what to clad it with, so went back to the mirror blinds. But these are actually not mirror blinds, these are extrusions, retail extrusions that you can get that are actually very tricky.
Giving away all our magic tricks.
But yeah, very, very meticulously adhered to the facade of this, or this, the exterior of this box. But the box itself is a media room. It's like sort of the place to watch TV, to watch a Disney film, but also to screen. This is Jamie Holmes, and he was screening this video piece for the first time here. So there's this blue interior place kind of like nestled within the box within the house. Here are those extrusions that we love to use so much. The house, which has a very kind of, I don't know, it's a very like beige, kind of simple palette, but when you're actually inside of it, there's a lot of texture. These are some custom-made terracotta tiles by a fabricator that we used in a while back and based in Long Beach. And all of the perimeter is actually just cement board from Home Depot, which was a discovery from the client who actually, after going through like 5 different GCs, ended up GCing it himself. And you know, a lot of these things were actually done sort of in collaboration with the client. Polycarb, stucco, and then just the kind of ever-present sky in Los Angeles.
And it is net zero.
Yeah,
Which is,
that was one of the other components of the brief.
Zero-scapes. I mean, there's considerations for, you know, in the context of Los Angeles to use the least amount of water as possible and make it as energy efficient as possible. Yeah.
Another component of the brief was to have water sounds everywhere. So we had these 2 kind of water features that are sort of inspired by like a Ronnie Horn sculpture. Some Knoll furniture. Knoll did a photo shoot in the space, which looked great. This is kind of the kitchen, which is really almost like the kind of the heart of the space, the one that gets used the most. Kind of like, it almost becomes kind of the family room, and it looks out to the yard, and it have these like sliding doors that open up, so it takes advantage of the indoor-outdoor.
Yeah, and I think this idea of like, you know, the compositional idea of like figures within figures, the main figure that reconfigures the house, but then the media cube, which is another kind of world inside of that. So there's a sort of nesting of these different spaces, and then they create sort of layers once you're moving around the house, and the inside and outside starts to become a little bit more overlapped.
And here's some of the art that's, you know, integrated within in the space. And then the play area and the pool.
Oh, the rocks are from, you know, tell the story about the rocks.
Yeah, the rocks got craned in. I think it was mid-pandemic, and we were sourcing the rocks from FaceTime, and they got craned in.
From the same quarry as Michael Heitzer's.
Oh, right.
Rock.
That's right. Yeah.
Those rocks are cousins of Michael Heitzer's giant rock at LACMA.
And LACMA, yeah. And shifting scales again to, you know, another kind of context, the retail context. We couldn't think of a better name, but retail, retail worlding.
We do a lot of retail.
But I think it was the first project we got to do together was this project in Seoul, Korea. So it was the first opportunity to work together and also to work in Korea, work outside the United States for our first project. So it was a really exceptional opportunity. And at the time, I think, you know, our aspiration was like, we want to do architecture, and, you know, this is interior. And so, you know, again, we're inheriting a boundary, and, you know, what you do with that boundary becomes the primary project. So here the idea was to clad the boundary in mirror and sort of expand it. It's almost kind of an ArchiZoom model, you know, put reflective material on it, that interior becomes now a landscape, and other parts of it become this sort of textured wall. I think that's like an ongoing interest is this idea of figure, this idea of field, and how you can deploy that at always different scales. And it's something we're still working with, but I think having worked, we've probably done over 50 stores over our career. But the idea of what a store is always changing. I mean, what a store is now and probably in the future will change. I think, you know, a store now is something like that. Why do you actually go to a store? And I think part of this question is what facilitates kind of an engagement, what makes an experience that's worth kind of, you know, leaving your phone to go get. Here's a space that is again like a landscape as much as we can think about an interior landscape where the fixtures are these kind of elements that sort of populate the space, and then we created all these kind of almost, you know, quasi sculptural spaces, again thinking like Dan Graham and whatnot. But I think what's kind of interesting about a space like this retail space, which is in the Lower East Side, is that the way that the client kind of uses, or the brand uses the space is more than it just being for display. It's actually a space of kind of social interaction, social engagement, a place for like conversations, mostly parties, but also like takeovers and adaptations. And I think that's what's kind of interesting to create a store that sort of gets sort of overtaken by the culture, if you will.
I think that, I mean, the one interesting thing about working in like cultural sector and like a commercial sector is like you start to just see the blurring of these two experiences, that in a lot of ways these brands want to have a space that works like a platform for, you know, cultural production, and then vice versa, these cultural spaces want to have these sort of immersive experiences that, you know, feel like you're stepping into a world. So the whole ecosystem, I think, starts to become more fluid and blended as opposed to like these very distinct environments.
And I think it's to think not about retail as purely transactional, but as like, again, like a platform, like a space of hospitality, like a space of kind of engagement, a place to have, you know, an AR, VR kind of gathering. This is a health store that doubles as a kind of meditation center and has sound healings. I mean, the other thing about interiors is, and especially with retail, is often is in some ways like a windowless or a one window only architecture that creates a kind of condition to work with. In this case, this is actually a cannabis store where the law actually prohibits you from having direct visibility from the storefront into see the product. So that becomes a kind of constraint and creates a kind of portal, which we were working with into some other world. The theme of this store is the travel agency, so metaphorically, but it gave a kind of like excuse to kind of play with like a surreal subway station, or to create a kind of escape kind of travel agency. The travel agency also is BIPOC owned, and they were like the third legal dispensary in the state of New York, and they teamed up with the Doe Fund. So more than half their proceeds went to supporting formerly incarcerated individuals. So a really great like client to work with, an amazing group. We got to reference Hans Hollein here, and then when we met and did the project at the Met, we got to share this with Max Hollein, Hans Hollein's son, and show that we ripped off his dad to do a fixture in a cannabis store. But there's also these kind of connections, I think, to display and to artifacts, and you know, in a lot of ways, doing an exhibition at the Met and doing a cannabis store have a lot more similarities than not.
Incredible collaboration with TM Lighting on this project, and again, I think this project really kind of shows that blurring of like a retail space and kind of like in some ways like a museum space.
Yeah. And I think that, you know, speaking of collaboration, like this was a project in which light was one of the primary materials. And oftentimes you have a lighting idea, but you never know if it's really going to work. But working with TM, like the ideas always kind of went a little bit farther, and that was pretty awesome. Awesome idea.
So just to wrap up, the last constellation of projects is Otherworldly, and I think it's a kind of ongoing conceptual project in which we were exploring the idea of a domestic or interior space, not necessarily as an envelope, but more as a collection of objects. And so these are all commissioned projects that think about domestic objects that prompt some kind of interaction between two people, whether it's like eating or meditating, so this is a sense, there's a pestle and a bowl and a tiffin, or these objects that are, these are sculptural seats that are a little bit like fancy yoga ball chairs that can be flipped in a number of different ways and have a kind of like interactive seating open-endedness, or thinking about a bath as a sensory deprivation tank. So this was commissioned for an exhibition at the Guggenheim in Bilbao, in which we designed a sensory deprivation tank for like deep meditation, in which the salt from that came from a nearby a salt quarry that dates back to the Roman Empire. And really thinking about interior worlds in the most expansive sense, both like within us, but also what does it mean to sort of transcend the boundary of our physicality. And I'll just end on an exhibition where we designed some fermentation vessels in the Schindler House for the Max Center, which has this long history of kind of convening and domestic life, in which the outdoor space became like a living room. And so we thought about what it would mean to turn the outdoor hearth into a kind of site for fermenting different foods with some fermentation experts. We actually think a lot about food when we make architecture. There's so many parallels in terms of how we relate to resources and how it really becomes, it can be the backdrop for everyday life or the kind of focal point as an aesthetic experience. And I think we really value architecture and design that has the ability to kind of recede into the background, but also create moments of awe and reflection that we might not otherwise be prompted to. So over the course of 3 months, they fermented lemons and also miso. And then at the end of the 3 months, we organized a tasting of that in the front lawn, which actually turned out pretty well. Yeah, it was definitely an experiment. And it was a really kind of nice way to convene people and think about the architecture of these vessels within this sort of space of this home. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Dominic and Chris. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Now, can you hear me? Okay, I'll speak loud.
Should we move over?
Is this on? Yes, it is. So thank you so much for sharing your beautiful work, your exuberant design process, and I think your projects are also a lot of fun. Not sure if that's intended. I'm going to open up the questions with a question for me, and then we're going to make sure this mic works, and we're going to hand it around because we would love to have questions from the group. I'm going to quote you. The space works like a platform for cultural production. Amazing. The Met Gala Sleeping Beauties exhibition space was so compelling and cerebral, so impressive to your fellow architects and designers. Do you ever seek to know the overall public, non-trained impression? Is it your goal, I'm sure it is, for the public to say more than, "This is so cool"? Do you define the desired reaction or opinion? Or do you rather enjoy standing back and watching it emerge organically?
Thanks. Thank you for that question. I mean, I think we try to, let's see, I think as architects, we are, you know, the discipline of architecture offers like a very specific set of tools in how we can interpret the world and also engage it in design spaces. And so I think part of our job as architects is to actually take that that kind of very specific knowledge of what it means to like think through a lens of architecture and design and literally make it relatable to other folks, and whether the general, I would say like publics understand the kind of intellectual process that went into that, or the references we might be, you know, pulling from the history of architecture or, you know, other art forms. Like that doesn't really matter. I think that's like for us and maybe the small group of, you know, other architects that we're in conversation with. And I think hopefully that's all just like material to make more meaningful spaces and cities and such. So yeah, I think ultimately the test is like, you know, can we make things that actually have meaning for people who are not us? And I think a lot of times we're working in communities that are not our own. And so that comes with a huge level of responsibility to understand who we're designing with, for, and who we're working in service of.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, you know, when doing an exhibition, I mean, I think there's sort of, or a living space. I mean, I think there's different ends. I mean, I think there's always an interesting feedback loop between how you kind of imagine a space, what your intellectual goals are versus how it actually is experienced. And I think you can do a space that's, you might have a kind of a premise, and that can be kind of separate and be for yourself. But I think I find it to be interesting, you know, to also understand how people use the space and whether it engages or not. Like to have done Ray or working on multifamily projects, like one of the projects in Greenpoint that we did, I know someone that lives there and get to go there and get to see what works well and what doesn't work well. And I actually find that very fascinating when a space works really well and when it doesn't work at all. I think that's actually really interesting because the idea is like not being adopted in a way. And so I think when an idea becomes adopted or is engaged with, I think that's when things become really alive and robust. So, yeah.
I don't know, does this work? Yeah, it works. All right, great. I think it works. All right. I had a quick question. You mentioned building within building. It sounds a little bit like architecture within architecture. You also talk about interiors. You know, this is someone under the aegis of the Interiors Committee here, but I'm curious, is there a distinction? Does it matter? Is it blurred? Is there something fundamentally different between the two? I mean, you do a little bit of everything, right? I'm just kind of curious.
Between architecture and interiors? Yeah. I think when we first started practicing, I would have said, yeah, there's a big difference. But I think as I personally get older, I don't try to make as much of a distinction. I actually try to think about everything as being more architecture. I think it's why we kind of landed on concluding the lecture with like vessels as being something that has like the same importance as like an urban scale campus. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, we were talking before about this question, obviously, because, and one thing we kind of realize is like one way of understanding interiors. Like it's a site, but it just has more boundaries around it. But it's still a site that has, you know, all these conditions in which you have to understand and deal with. And so in that regard, there's no difference. But I think the one thing we really appreciate about interiors, which we talked about, is that it really works at the scale of the human body, like in a way that buildings operate at multiple scales. But yeah, you're just always aware of your body in interiors, and a sensitivity to the tactility of materiality versus the optical effects of materiality, which you might see a building but never go in it. It's you know, so there's a different sensibility, I think, that comes with thinking about interior space or interiors.
I think it's all really interesting to think about interiors now, also in an age where there's so much, the way we engage socially, so much has to do with the phone and through these kind of like digital environments. There's a person that, you know, we work with, Paul Nakazawa, who actually was, I think, managing partner at Softy for a while, Moshe Softy's office, and he sort of said, if I were to go back to architecture school, I would either study interiors or I would study landscape. And there's sort of these two opposing things. One is more going internal and one is going super expansive. And these are the kind of the most relevant domains of kind of the current time we live in. And in some ways, buildings are maybe not as relevant as they used to be, but interiors and landscapes, the environment, like, have more relevance. So I thought that was interesting.
I mean, I think there's like just also a real practical aspect of it. Like, we just need to do more adaptive reuse. And so interiors are, you know, more resourceful to have a real understanding of how to make interiors create these worlds that we need to. And yeah, I agree. Like this whole kind of virtual physical world we live in a lot of ways, some of these, you know, thinking of interiors, oftentimes it's like thinking of portals into worlds in the same way that you think of a portal as an interface into some immersive environment. And that's actually come up a lot. And I think why we really actually embrace the materiality of like this idea of like really grounding people in their bodies is such a, I think, an important thing that architecture can do, or interiors. Are we supposed to pick or someone? Yeah, and that's a great question. We would love to go back and photograph all our projects with people and like kind of how Chris was saying, how they're used and interpreted. And there's a kind of practical aspect to like when the project's done, we get it photographed, but there is a real ambition. Like for example, the Anita Mae Rosenstein campus, we would love to actually document how it's kind of become part of the community. Yeah, that's kind of what it's all about. Yeah. So it's a great question, yeah.
Hi, I have a question for you. My name is Leslie, by the way. In what ways can architecture choreograph bodily movements, not just through spatial sequence, but through sensorial thresholds, like scent, heat, and texture? And how might those non-visual cues shape the way we inhabit or remember space? Because in a lot of your projects, we talk about the immersive experience of the occupants in the space, and most of them are non-visual, but they direct your visual decisions.
What the question is, how can non-visual senses engage?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it reminds me of plasma, and how he talked about how senses influence architecture and how the body interacts with space through the non-visual senses?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, for example, in the Costume Institute exhibition, there was a lot of thought around how to create ways to interact with the archive or the garments through sound and touch and smell, and that architecture can do that consciously or unconsciously. I mean, like there's phenomena like, you know, you could go and smell this building, whether it was designed to be smelled or not. Yeah, I think we're really thinking about that a lot. We're also thinking about it from an accessibility point of view. How do we move beyond considering architecture through vision, even though we have photos with present all the work, but yeah, I think those are really important considerations to think about the body and all of its sensing capacities and beyond just vision. Yeah.
So thanks for the presentation. It was excellent. I'm really curious about the dynamic between you as brothers and partners and individuals. And I'm wondering how the dynamic works in regards to like your individual references. You've mentioned people like Moshe Safdie, Louis Kahn, Dan Graham, Michael Heiser. And I wonder, do you have like the same references? Do you have like individual diverting references? How do you get together like what you include and disinclude? And I also would be curious to know about the dynamic of the firm within your partnership.
I mean, we're definitely like have a lot of shared references. I think the more we practice together, realize that we also have different interests, and that's like part of embracing that. I think the dynamic is always, I don't know, like working with your brother is such a unique, it's both a kind of like such a unique and like such a gift, and it's also such a thing of, we have such familiarity that like finding the boundary is where it becomes kind of challenging, you know, because we're always sort of like in the same interior, and looking to kind of define our interior, like define our own worlds in our own interior.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked a lot about having a plurality of voices in the practice, and like this dynamic, which is like we have a second hand, right? Like, or a lot of ways are references. We talk a lot about, oh, is that just like, is that weird enough? Like, is that kind of like, does that feel like, and it's something that's really hard to put a finger on, but I think we, like, for example, that's a kind of brother thing where we just know there's something about it, a certain, you can just like look at something like, yeah, that's kind of weird. That's like weird in a good way, or no, that's weird in a not the weird way we want. And that's hard to put into, actually to articulate to other people, but I think it just comes out of this, like we've traveled together, we've looked at the same buildings together, like we have like in a way our inherited like ideas from architecture, like when he was at school versus when I was at school, we were always sharing and talking about it. So there is like a language that we have, and then, but yeah, then I think there's ways in which we want to apply that language, which are probably different, and that's actually, you know, a real, that's like a lot of richness comes out of that, so.
Yeah, I mean, I think like any partnership, like there's a lot of shared interests. How we both might want to get there might be different, like who's at the steering wheel is the question, but I think there's a lot of like common alignment about where we want to get to. And that's, you know, how you, that's always a trade-off. Like I think some of the best projects, Dominic would start, then I would come in, and then maybe Dominic would finish. Yes, yeah, there's a lot of, yeah, there's a lot of like, I mean, I think any partnership, I think there's like different dynamics, you know.
Thank you again for tonight's lecture. This is on? So to build on Susan's question and your reference about engaging people, but then I was going to challenge you on that, but you actually referenced it yourself in the weirdness, because I really want to ask about the uncanny and the role that it plays in your work, because there is a perversity in the work, and you take this sort of sadistic pleasure in some of your design. And I'd like to know more about that.
I mean, in some ways,
I think we try to avoid like the loftiness of a word like uncanny, because I think, yeah, it's like I'd rather someone else like describe the work in that regard than trying to say that is our goal, really. But at the same time, yeah, I think we are interested in a kind of aesthetic experience that feels like a little unfamiliar, and that's very different than, I think, an experience that kind of like hits you over the head with being different. So we're always looking for this subtle shift of every day that draws you in, and then you realize like, oh, this is different, or this material is not what I expected, or so yeah, maybe that is a type of uncanny or weirdness. And I think, yeah, there's a sociality to that, because I think the one thing I've always had problems with, like with how phenomenology has been interpreted in architecture, it's always through one person perceiving and having an experience. And I think it's much more interesting to think about how we have these experiences collectively or together. And to me, that's a more interesting way to think about architecture rather than through one person's subjectivity.
what do you mean by sadistic pleasure?
I was going to ask the same thing, but I just ran with it.
I always think that design requires a certain amount of tension.
Yeah.
And it's a matter of knowing when to set the rules and when to break it. Mark Jacobs would use the phrase, the right amount of raw. And as you say, is that weird enough? But there's a delight, there's a playfulness in your work. It's about making some of the familiar a little unfamiliar and challenging people. But I think in a good way. And I mean, that's where you're taking pleasure in it.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that. I mean, the one thing I will say is like Dominic's voice in my head is always, is it weird enough? Because I think my tendency is always to normalize, I would say. And I think that, you know, I always like it's not gone far enough. So I think that's sort of the dynamic, and I think that's like the strength of why I appreciate working with you, is because there's always like this voice to question the thing. And I agree with you. Design is all about tension. What's the right amount of tension? If there's no tension, what's the point? I mean, in terms of really working hard at something, which is, it takes a lot of work to design something.
Are there any other questions?
Hi. You speak a lot about materiality. I was curious what materials, I guess at the moment, you're really interested in. It's probably ever shifting, I'm guessing, but I guess what materials and why?
I think we just did a project with cork.
Yeah, that was fun. Yeah, I think we're obviously trying to think about using materials that are like resourceful, and also what the aesthetic possibilities are with them. And so, yeah, we did a project with cork, which was really interesting. We sort of created this like urban furniture, and it was, yeah, in a way, it's material that actually is the bark of a tree, obviously, but most oftentimes it's used on interior surfaces. So again, like, what does it mean to like use it like an exterior public space. And we're thinking more and more about sourcing materials. We just did a project in Hawaii where our families are from Hawaii, and we built a project that's in the Cooper Hewitt Triano right now. It's a hale, which is a traditional Hawaiian structure. And we thought a lot about the wood that we used in that. And it's a long story, but it's thinking about wood, and not just as a resource, but actually from an indigenous point of view, like an ancestor. And I think really understanding in an intimate way what our relationship is to the material world, and moving beyond like product and thinking about the relationality of materiality, which I think is really important, and something in a lot of ways to recover in how we understand place and the materials that make up a place.
Great lecture. So I was picking up on Eric's question that you're brothers. Weird and normal came up, tension came up. You went to two different schools, Cal Poly and Cal Berkeley. I was curious, what is the distinction between those two, and why did you choose those?
Schools?
Yeah, schools.
Oh, that's an easy answer.
Okay, I'm a Cal Poly graduate.
Oh, amazing, yeah.
So,
well, like, Chris is older, so he went to Berkeley, studied architecture, and I would just see him come home from school with like these amazing models that he built. I was like, oh, that's cool, I want to do that. And then I didn't get into Berkeley. Chris has always been the better student. But I love surfing. And so I was like, okay, if I go to Cal Poly SLO, I can study architecture and surf. And that was pretty much the answer.
do you know Craig Steele?
I don't know him personally, but I know of his work, and we've literally been like, I think, 1 degree of separation, yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.